For tonight's query journey, I asked the keeper of the time portal, what are the primary accounts and official reports surrounding the 1947 Roswell incident, and how have they evolved over time? Here's a partial reply to the query from the keeper from which our guest hosts for tonight's journey were chosen. Richard Dolan, Intelligent Disclosure. Ross Coulthart, Reality Check at News Nation. Kurt Jaimungal, The Theories of Everything. Jesse Michaels, American Alchemy. And Andy, That UFO Podcast. Let's jump into it. What are the primary accounts and official reports surrounding the 1947 Roswell incident, and how have they evolved over time?
Now I want to take you back to the event itself, and I want to show you as much as I can in a relatively short video of what happened during the Roswell event and its aftermath. Now I say short, this is actually going to be a little bit longer than some of my other live streams. Maybe most of those are usually like 20 minutes. This might be 35, maybe 40 minutes. I'm doing this video as part of a series that I thought would be fun to do, which is to follow the cases discussed in the TV series Project Blue Book. And that show covers, on the History Channel, it covers UFO cases with a mixture of fact and dramatic fiction. And what I want to do here is to cover those cases as strictly factually as I can. Since that series opened their season 2 with 2 episodes on Roswell, that's what I'm doing here. Now, of course, Roswell has been subject to much more detailed analysis in many places. Many books, many long documentaries have been devoted to Roswell. And there are people, like when I talked about Roswell the last time, there were people like, oh no, not Roswell again. And that makes me laugh. And I get that a little bit. I mean, in the sense, when you think of the UFO phenomenon in its totality, Roswell is just a sliver of so many interesting things to talk about. So I do understand that. But keep in mind something, that in its totality with the UFO, with the world public, I guess I should say, Roswell occupies a huge amount of space. And some people say, well, it doesn't deserve it. But I would say, look, Roswell is a strong case, and there is a reason why it became so iconic. It's actually a very strong case. There's a lot of witnesses who've talked about what happened there. And I feel like as we move further and further into the 21st century, where it often feels like history itself can be redigitized and subject to Orwellian revision at any time, I think it's very important to continually reassess what happened at Roswell way, way back in 1947. So that's what I want to do here. I think the Roswell case is important. When you hear an overview of it that I'm going to give now, I suspect you will agree, and you may be reminded of a lot of things that you've forgotten or maybe you never even knew. So one thing that's helpful to keep in mind is that in the early summer of 1947, there were a lot of, because that's when the Roswell event happened, there were many things that give us an important backdrop as to what was going on. So one is that the Second World War itself had only recently ended. And it's very easy for us to forget that now, but since the Second World War was 80 years ago, okay? But that war gripped the entire world, and it left millions upon millions dead and millions more homeless at the end of that war. There was tremendous hunger and pain and social upheaval in many parts of the world that also followed in the wake of the Second World War. And it was only 2 years earlier. It ended just 2 years before Roswell. In addition, there was a new global geopolitical rivalry in the form of what was even then being called a Cold War. Not a hot war with guns and bombs and battles, but a cold one, using propaganda, economic measures, political control over foreign governments between the United States and the Soviet Union, that is Russia. And there was certainly a lot of tension on both sides regarding that whole thing. And then there was also a great deal of tension over the fact that humanity had recently developed a new weapon with new scientific principles that unleashed devastating destruction in a way that no previous weapons could ever do. And that, of course, was the atomic bomb. And people began to realize that with enough of those types of weapons, The next big war could actually mark the end of human civilization. So that's a small taste of the world of 1947 when something strange came down in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. But there's even a little more background I want to go over with you, and that's the background of UFO sightings themselves. During the war and immediately after the war, there had been sightings by military personnel and by civilians of aerial objects that just did not make any sense to anybody. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but they occurred in the European theater of the Second World War. They occurred in the Pacific theater of the Second World War. And then after the war, they appeared in a variety of places, most notoriously over Scandinavia, but also over a lot of Europe and beyond Europe. The ones over Scandinavia were called ghost rockets. To this day, there has not been a satisfying answer as to what those things were or who was responsible for them. But we do know that they got the attention of many nations, and the United States intelligence community, which was a lot smaller then than it is today, was definitely concerned about these objects. Now then we get to 1947. And there actually were a number of very interesting sightings in the U.S. of inexplicable objects in the sky before Roswell, and even before the Kenneth Arnold sighting of June 24th in the state of Washington. But when you get Arnold's sighting, it was very interesting. What he saw as a private pilot were a number of aerial objects that looked like crescent-shaped craft moving at incredible speeds, over 1,000 miles per hour, which back then was not supposed to be possible. The phrase flying saucer was born. And then it was like a dam had burst. Sightings were being reported everywhere. Some of these sightings were obviously people getting excited about who knows what that they saw, but others were definitely not like that. In fact, one that I think I will cover in the future was a series of sightings over what would later be called Edwards Air Force Base in California. At the time, it was known as Muroc Field. I will come back to that, but it was very interesting, and I still would say inexplicable. The point is that something very odd was going on, and there was no reasonable explanation that anyone could come up with to explain these things. Objects that didn't look normal, that did not behave normally, were being seen and reported by many people. And the tight control over mainstream media that we take for granted today didn't really exist to anywhere nearly that extent in 1947. Back then, there were thousands of independent newspapers everywhere. They were willing to report what was happening. So in that environment, something came down about 75 miles north of the town of Roswell, New Mexico. On Saturday, July 5th, 1947, a sheep herder named Mac Brazel, he was foreman of a ranch called the Foster Ranch. He found crashed debris scattered over a fairly wide area. This was, now, here's the thing. None of us were with Brazel. There are no photos of what actually was there. We're going with statements that he made, which he then had to recant, and which were repeated by other people to newspapers and to friends and so forth. But one thing that he reported or apparently said is that the material seemed unusually lightweight and unusually strong. There was metal, there were plastic-like beams, there was lightweight but strong material, foil, string-like material. I'm not going to say string, I'm going to say string-like material because that's what it seemed like. Brazel told his nearest neighbors, they were named the Proctors, but they apparently were too busy to visit the field at the time, although at some later point, Brazel showed them some fragments, which he said he had tried and failed to cut or burn. So Sunday, July 6th, Brazel brings some of this debris to the sheriff of Roswell, a man named George Wilcox. Wilcox sends 2 deputies to investigate. They never make it. Keep in mind that this place is remote. Undoubtedly, they didn't have perfect directions. The terrain out there was definitely not hospitable to most 4-wheeled vehicles. I know this myself. I went out to the debris field on one occasion. It is remote. It is not even now. It's not easy to drive out there. Had to be way, way tougher in 1947. They did apparently report back that they found an area that looked burned and that where the desert sand was glass-like. If that's true, that's very interesting, and it's indicative of very high heat doing something to the terrain. And in fact, I'll get into a little bit later, that was corroborated apparently by one other very important witness, a man named Dr. Lincoln La Paz. I'll get to him.
I would love, Paolo, could you tell us some of the famous events or UFO events in Italian lore? What would potentially be the Italian Roswell?
The potential Roswell is rather easily said. That happened in 1933. And what is interesting is it is really interesting, not just because it predates Roswell of 14 years, but what is really interesting is that in 1933 in Italy, we already see all the main ingredients at work, the main ingredients that we came to know very well with Roswell and other cases. We have, first of all, the immediate secrecy, first. Then we have the cover up and deception immediately after. Then we have the scientific high level study. So in Italy in 1933, June 1933, we see these ingredients already at work, perfectly as it happened in the United States of 1947. And this is important because, I mean, just to quickly, just for a quick recap of the situation, in 1933, in northern Italy, a mysterious aircraft of unknown origin landed or crashed. This is not known for sure. In any case, we say landed in northern Italy, not far from Milano and the Lake of Como, more or less. So they say that this mysterious aircraft, and by the way, I say mysterious, and if they called it mysterious, it must have been really mysterious because I mean, aviation in Italy in 1933, Italy under Mussolini was kept in very high regard, and it was one of the key sectors of the Italian army in general. So, I mean, if they say that it was unknown, it really means that it was something unidentifiable. Okay, so what is interesting is that nowadays we have the copies of various telegrams which were sent by the press agency, the only press agency of the regime, which was called Stefani Agency. And there are at least 4 of these messages which were broadcast to all the offices with the highest priority, and they were not top secret, but riservatissimo is confidential, were classified as confidential. And today we have the copy. I mean, we have the originals because most of these are owned by Roberto Pinotti himself. We have the originals of these telegrams, and so you can imagine that. I mean, just by the sheer number of telegrams that were sent in one day, I mean, 4 telegraphs of the highest priority and high classification that were sent in that day. So you can understand just from this fact that the matter was considered very, very seriously. So then what happened? It looked like these debris or this what remained of this unknown aircraft was conserved in a hangar owned by the CI Marchetti, which was I think it was the main aircraft producer of that time, where they were kept for study, and it is said that Mussolini assembled a sort of Majestic 12, so to speak, which was called RS 33, RS like Romeo Sierra 33, which stand for Special Research. 33 is the year of foundation, which was headed by Guglielmo Marconi, by the way. And they tried to, and it is said that they tried to investigate, of course, trying to understand what this device was and so on. And then what happened? Then came the war. At the end of the war, what remained of this unknown aircraft was confiscated by the Americans and was sent to the US. One thing which is interesting is that in 2010, at the 2010 Congress of San Marino, we had an intervention by a gentleman by the name of William Brophy, who said that his father was an officer in the U.S. Air Force. In 1948, if I remember well, he had the possibility to see the corpse kept under formalin of two aliens of the Nordic kind, so to speak, high, quite tall, pale, white hair, and so on. Classic, the classic kind of Nordic aliens, as we call them. And he said that his father told him that these two bodies were confiscated in Italy at the end of the war. So this is something that was not known. And there, of course, there are many rumors, many uncontrolled voices concerning the subject. One is that Mussolini, when he came to know and very likely could have seen these two bodies, could have been led to think that they could have been German, and so he could have thought that if the Germans have this kind of weapons, of course, we can ally. Italy can ally with Germany, and of course, we will war. We will win the war very easily. So, but of course, this is something which, I mean, they're just rumors. So take them at face value. I mean, don't it's not possible to do any historic check. Also, concerning the Italian Majestic 12, this RS-33 cabinet, there are traces in these documents that have been sent anonymously to Roberto Pinotti, and not only to Roberto Pinotti, but also to a couple of other not reviews, how can I say, papers,
Sure.
newspapers. And there are, I mean, in these papers, which are papers of the Senate of the Republic. I mean, there is the emblem of the Senate of the Republic, and there is mention of this very secret RS-33 cabinet, which was meant to have top priority over everything. Not even the University of the Vatican should have been informed about their findings. So this is for sure the we could call it the Italian Roswell, if you wish. And it is interesting because we see that, I mean, we know Roswell, we know more or less how it worked, we know the mechanism after this event. I mean, the mechanism that this event triggered. But it is interesting to see that exactly the same thing happened in the fascist Italy of 1933, you see. So this is something that it is important. And it is important, Andy, not only for this, but also because, especially for the youngest generations, or those who have just started to taking some interest in this subject of UFOs/ETs, I would like to dispel the notion that UFOs and maybe ETs is something new. No, it's not new at all, because at least in 1933 started. And if we really want to go, how can I say, in the past, we can see a lot of traces of what we could call today UFO events. Like the Romans even had a specific name for these UFOs. They called them clipeus ardentes, which means fiery shields. So because they also saw sometimes these shields. Most of the time they were glowing, and so they created this name. So I mean, the again, what I want to stress is that the phenomenon is not new at all. It's being taken. What is new is that it's being taken seriously, and that is new, actually, really. But the phenomenon itself is not new at all.
Before 1945, and the Pope Pius XII back-channeled that.
So the Vatican was involved?
Yeah, and told the Americans what the Italians had, and we ended up scooping it.
So let me be very clear about this. You're saying that the Catholic Church, the Vatican, they know about the existence of non-human intelligence on this planet?
Certainly.
Grusch says shortly after the dawn of the atomic age, another major crash recovery took place. You've probably heard of it.
What can you tell me about the Roswell craft?
Fortunately, those details were not approved for me to talk about right now.
This much we know. In 1947, an object crashed in the New Mexico desert near the town of Roswell. The Air Force recovered material described as metallic and rubbery, though the government changed its story as to what it was, calling it a flying disc at first, then a weather or spy balloon.
It just read ridiculous to me that the US Air Force had changed its story.
Yeah, and they added additional elements over time and tried to conflate additional programs to explain some of the events.
Why are these things crashing?
Yeah, some are landed, some are crashed, and I think that's an interesting discussion that's come up. As advanced as we are, as humans, right? Planes crash, cars crash. Just because you're some advanced sentience that has advanced technology doesn't mean some small percentage of your, I'll use the Air Force term like sorties, meet an unfortunate operational conclusion, as we might want to say.
Most people would tell you the Roswell incident has been thoroughly debunked. In fact, the Air Force published this report in 1994 to put the issue to rest once and for all. Grusch has read it.
That analysis they did was a total hack job, and even anybody with analytical skills, if you read it, you can deduce that they're conflating multiple situations with crash test dummies and mogul balloons, and they're just saying that the townsfolk who personally witnessed it were totally imagining things. They concocted that whole report just to disinform.
So the reason for the secrecy exactly is what?
Feudalistic dominance, who can have both asymmetric technology for, it seems like, just fueling the war machine.
Grusch says that through the 50s and 60s, encounters with the NHI continued, as did the cover-up. One incident in 1967, about which multiple Air Force veterans have gone public, involved UAPs tampering with the nuclear missiles at Malmstrom Air Base in Montana.
They saw a craft, appearing to be intelligently controlled, hovered over a nuclear weapons silo and shut down 10 nuclear ICBM missiles.
It certainly looks like they want to understand how far we've advanced in are nuclear fizzle kind of technologies at the very least. I mean, it looks like preparatory probing activity. It might be innocent kind of scientific gathering, could be ISR probing.
Meanwhile, Grusch says the crash retrieval program continued. And while he won't reveal where the downed craft are stored, he does say that the people working with the technology have been putting themselves at risk.
You know, a lot of them, were injured looking at some of this stuff. You can imagine the nuclear, radiological, and biological risk to looking at an unknown, and a lot of them have literally suffered physically because of their service.
But as we know, anyone who's come forward claiming non-human intelligence is behind these incidents has been dismissed as delusional or deliberately deceitful.
If you're right, if you're telling us the truth, everyone, the entire American public, has been lied to for decades.
Yeah, there's a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the U.S. populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral.
Substantiated, they encountered these UFOs, these UAP, as well.
But Lou, I know the report of Colares. Officially, according to the Brazilian government, Colares didn't find any evidence at all.
Yeah. Well, that was not the case, and it was very clear that it was a very legitimate investigation, and what they found was that these things were coming in and out of the area and harming people.
As Lou went further down the rabbit hole, he says he learned that many of the classic UFO cases were in fact much more than legends, including the famous incident in Roswell, New Mexico.
Roswell, 1947. What happened?
There was a UAP that crashed. In fact, there were two UAP that crashed, and one flew away while the other one did not, and it was recovered by the U.S. government.
You must appreciate people watching this, hearing you talking about aliens, recovered craft, recovered bodies. It sounds crazy.
Well, as I've said before, I'm not saying it doesn't sound crazy. What I'm saying is it's real.
Of course, he's incredibly credible, and he's an amazing human being. I believed it because what he was saying aligned with my 30 years of research.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all the different locations that I've gone to, particularly Virginia, but I've investigated Roswell too. I mean, I've been out there.
Yeah.
I went to the 50th anniversary of Roswell.
Yeah.
And the advantage I had back then was there was a lot of momentum, a lot of talk, a lot of things happening. There were at least 20 people that were in Roswell at the time that I got to meet with when I was there.
And they were all
talking about the threats. They'll be picking your bones out of the desert. I had guys tell me this is what was said at the time. Not only will they be picking your bones out of the desert, but your family's bones out of the desert. They told me that. Lots of different people told me that.
I was just with the founder of a very prominent multi-billion-dollar, Fortune 500 company, like beyond reproach. This guy's not a liar.
He's legit.
Yeah, and he's also super humble and like out of the limelight actually as a founder.
He's like 20 years old. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, well, won't give any more detail, but I'm with him. We're talking, and turns out he watches the show, and I'm like, "What you watch? Like, why you don't have time to watch about aliens?" Right. He goes, "Well, let me tell you, at the end of his life, my grandfather was in, the 509th Atomic Bomber Squadron. He was stationed at Roswell in 47. And he goes, he wasn't there when the crash happened, but he came back to base. And he came back and he said that everybody was beyond spooked, beyond a weather balloon landing, beyond some test dummy. The Air Force keeps changing their story. It's all BS or whatever. But like people were pale in the face and psychologically really messed up. And so when I hear a story like that from him, and he said his grandfather was like an old school guy who would barely talk, and he really started to come out like towards his death. And so you hear thing after thing like that, and you're like, something happened there.
Whole flock of microphones there. They wanted me they wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that. So all I could do is keep my mouth shut.
Something really profound.
When I was making Out of the Blue,
mm-hmm.
and it's funny, like some of the things that never even make it into any of my documentaries are the things that propel me more than anything else, any other bit of evidence or bit of testimony that's on camera. I was making Out of the Blue, and the woman who owned the building where we were editing the film, when I wasn't editing at my house, we were going back and forth. She was 88, and she told, when she found out what we were doing, she told my partner, Boris, who I've made, he's been partners with me, Boris Zuboff, on all the films I've ever made since I was in my early 20s. And Boris goes, yeah, the lady who owns the building wants to meet with you. I said, really? Why? He goes, I don't know. You found out what you're doing and wants to have tea. I said, oh, okay. He goes, I suggest go have tea with her. So I said, fine. Biggest regret that I didn't put it on camera. But anyway, so we meet, and she's like, I heard you were doing this documentary on UFOs. And I said, yeah. And she's pouring me tea, and she's like, I just want you to know I've never told anybody this. But it was either husband or almost husband, boyfriend at the time in the early 50s told her, he was a very prominent scientist, that a spaceship crashed in New Mexico and that there were bodies, aliens recovered. She's like, he told me that in the 50s. and I'll never forget. And when he says that's what happened, by golly, that's what happened. She says, I couldn't talk about it with anybody, but I wanted you to know that. I said, thank you. That really resonated with me.
Oh, of course.
Do you know what I mean? Like, why would she do that?
Why would she do that? And we were just talking.
Why would she do that?
We were driving over here, and you were telling me about Buzz Aldrin's the second man to walk on the moon.
Yes.
His sister. Yes. What did she say? I'll let you.
If you come into possession of something, and you've spent the money on recovering it yourself, it's an incentive for people to develop the technology that might arise from that recovery, that they enjoy the private ownership of that material. So one of the issues that we have behind all of this is, let's assume, hypothetically, that there are private aerospace companies that have been sitting on technology for 50, 60, 70 years. In the first category, let's say Roswell happened in 1947, and let's say around about 1950 or so, or perhaps in the 1970s, the Roswell craft was passed on to a private aerospace company. What happens then if they've had possession of that object for 50, 60 years? Does the US government really have a claim on that technology? In law, there's a question mark. And what if, as I noticed somebody was recently asserting just in the last 24 hours on Twitter, what if, say, technology from recoveries in the US has been moved extraterritorially into Canada? Oh, gee, that's interesting. What if Canada was secretly in possession of retrieved technology that is owned by a US aerospace company and being worked on by, say, Canadian government scientists in collaboration with US scientists? What's the law on that? Does the US Congress have extraterritorial control over that technology? Interesting question. And then separately from that, another loophole that you could drive a truck through here is, what if those private aerospace companies have recovered that technology using private military contractors, as I understand has very much been the case in the last few years? What if it's been entirely recovered by those private aerospace companies, perhaps in collaboration with the US government, but they've spent all the money and all the resources on doing that? Shouldn't they ought properly to have the rights to that technology? I mean, imagine hypothetically if it is true. Just imagine if it is true that, say, Lockheed Martin has a spacecraft. Let's say they've got a perfectly operating flying saucer from, say, I don't know, Kingman, Texas, sitting on blocks somewhere in a cave, sitting in a private facility somewhere. Why do they have to give that technology knowledge to the Congress? And why should they? They're a private aerospace company. They've got every reason to want to develop an advantage over their corporate rivals.
Even if that company was dealing with the government?
Well, that's the issue. The issue is, I've spoken to people at a very high level in Silicon Valley who have resources and money, who are very angry